Whispers of the night. The city never truly slept. It only pretended to, draping itself in a false stillness, while life continued to pulse beneath its steel veins. Neon lights flickered against the rain-soaked pavement, the occasional honk of a distant car breaking through the murmurs of the midnight wind. Somewhere in this restless landscape, beneath an old stone bridge in Jackson Park, two figures huddled together against the bitter night air. Eli and Nia, twins, survivors, ghosts of a system that had long since forgotten them. At only 12 years old, they had learned the art of vanishing, of slipping between the cracks of a city too busy to care. They lived in the places no one looked, under bridges, behind dumpsters, in the hollow shells of abandoned buildings where shadows swallowed secrets whole. Here, Eli murmured, pressing a half-eaten sandwich into Nia's small hands. His voice was quiet, barely more than a breath against the wind. "Eat slow. Make it last." Nia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the bread. It was stale, the edges crusted with dryness, but hunger made such details irrelevant. She took a small bite, chewing slowly as Eli had told her, though her stomach growled with a gnawing ache that had become all too familiar. She wanted to save some for later, for tomorrow, but she had learned that later was never guaranteed. The cold crept through their thin layers of clothing, settling deep into their bones. Eli shifted closer to his sister, wrapping an arm around her for warmth. They had no pillows, no mattress, just a tattered blanket barely thick enough to keep the chill away. It wasn't enough, but it was all they had. "You think it'll snow?" Nia asked softly, her breath visible in the air. Eli glanced at the sky. The clouds hung low, heavy with the weight of something yet to fall. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not tonight." Nia nodded and tucked her knees under her chin. She used to love the snow, back when they had a home, back when their mother would press steaming mugs of hot chocolate into their hands, when the world felt safe, when laughter was something they allowed themselves to have. But that was before. Before the world tilted on its axis. Before their mother whispered that they had to run, that they had to disappear. Before they became ghosts. Before the man in the shadows. A shiver ran down Nia's spine, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her. She didn't want to think about him. Not now. Not ever. Eli must have sensed the shift in her thoughts, because he nudged her gently. "Hey," he whispered, "remember what Mom used to say about the stars?" Nia closed her eyes, letting the memory come to her. Their mother's voice, warm, soothing, like a lullaby in the dark. Even when you can't see them, the stars are always there, just like love, just like hope. You only have to believe. Tears burned behind her closed lids, but she refused to let them fall. "I remember," she whispered. Eli smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Then we just have to keep believing." Nia nodded, but she wasn't sure she still could. The sound of footsteps shattered the fragile quiet. Both twins froze. Eli's fingers instinctively curled around the rusted pocket knife he kept tucked in his sleeve. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it made him feel less powerless. Beside him, Nia clutched their mother's old leather journal tighter to her chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, not hurried like a jogger, not stumbling like a drunk. Someone was looking. For them. Eli tensed, every muscle in his small body ready to bolt. He had learned early on that running was their best defense. They were small, fast. The city had 1,000 places to hide, and they knew most of them. But something about these footsteps made him pause. Then came the voice. "You shouldn't be here," deep, calm, worn down by years of something heavier than exhaustion. Eli turned his head, his eyes narrowing at the silhouette standing just beyond the bridge's edge. The glow of a distant street lamp caught the faint gleam of a badge clipped to the man's belt. A cop. Eli's grip on the pocket knife tightened. The officer took a slow step forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform slightly wrinkled, as if he'd been wearing it for hours past his shift. His face was lined with something old. Guilt, maybe. His tired brown eyes softened when they landed on the two children before him. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something behind it. Something Eli couldn't quite place. "Then leave," Eli shot back. The officer hesitated. "I can't do that." Eli stood, shielding Nia behind him. "We don't need your help." "You shouldn't be out here alone," the officer pressed. "It's not safe." Eli let out a bitter laugh. "Now you care." A flicker of pain crossed the officer's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He took another step forward, but this time he crouched slightly, lowering himself to their level. He wasn't towering over them now. He wasn't a threat. But Eli knew better than to trust the kindness of strangers. "Where are your parents?" the officer asked gently. Nia flinched. Eli's jaw clenched. "Gone." The officer's eyes darkened. "Who takes care of you?" Eli didn't answer. The officer sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, as if trying to push away something heavy. "Look, kid, I know what it's like to be alone." Eli frowned, not expecting those words. The officer continued, "I know what it's like to feel like the world's turned its back on you. But this," he gestured around them, "this isn't a life for kids." Eli bit the inside of his cheek. He didn't want to admit that the man was right. He didn't want to admit how tired he was, how hungry, how much he wished things were different. But wishes didn't change reality. "Just let us go," Eli muttered. The officer hesitated. "At least tell me your names." Silence. The officer tried again. "I'm Daniel Mercer." More silence. Then, quietly, Nia spoke. "Eli," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm Nia." Daniel Mercer smiled faintly. "Nice to meet you, Eli and Nia." Eli didn't return the sentiment. Mercer exhaled, glancing at the leather-bound book still clutched in Nia's hands. "What's that?" he asked. Nia stiffened. "Nothing," Eli said quickly. But Mercer wasn't convinced. He had spent years in law enforcement. He had seen people cling to things that mattered. He had done the same once. And the way Nia held that journal, it mattered. Mercer studied them both carefully. He saw beyond the dirt-streaked faces and thin clothes. He saw fear. He saw something deeper than just two kids trying to survive. He saw secrets. "Listen," he said after a long moment. "You don't have to trust me, but I can't walk away knowing you'll spend another night out here." Eli's eyes burned with defiance. "We don't need saving." Mercer met his gaze, and for the first time, Eli saw it. Not pity, not judgment, but something else. Regret, guilt, and something even deeper than that. A promise. And for the first time in a long time, Eli didn't know whether to run or to stay. The man with haunted eyes. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant gasoline, the city's restless breath exhaling through the alleys and crumbling brick walls. The streetlights flickered, buzzing like dying fireflies, their glow failing to reach the shadows where Eli and Nia stood. The officer, Daniel Mercer, was still there, his gaze steady but unreadable. Eli didn't trust him. Cops were trouble. Cops asked too many questions. Cops made people disappear. Eli had learned long ago that trusting the wrong person could cost them everything. Mercer must have sensed his hesitation because he didn't press forward. Instead, he crouched down, his elbows resting on his knees, making himself smaller, less threatening. His uniform, though neat, looked worn, his boots scuffed from long hours on the job. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who carried his own ghosts. "Look, I get it," Mercer said, voice low and even. "You don't want help. I'm not here to drag you off to some group home or throw you in the system. But two kids alone in this city." He shook his head. "It's not safe." Eli's fingers curled into fists. "We take care of ourselves." Mercer sighed, glancing away for a moment. "That's what I used to say too." Eli frowned. He wasn't sure if Mercer was lying or not, but something in his voice sounded real. Nia, still clutching the leather-bound journal to her chest, finally spoke. "Why do you care?" The question hung between them like fog on a cold morning. Mercer hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "Because I've seen what happens when no one does." Eli didn't like that answer. It felt too close, too dangerous. "Not our problem," he muttered, grabbing Nia's wrist. "We're leaving." Mercer stood but didn't move to stop them. "Where?" Eli froze. It was a simple question, but one that twisted something deep inside him, because he didn't have an answer. Nia looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She knew, just as well as he did, that they had nowhere left to go. They had exhausted their hiding spots, had scored every alley, every abandoned building. The city was closing in on them. And winter was coming. Mercer must have seen it too. "I know you don't trust me," he said. "I wouldn't trust me either if I were you." Eli scowled. "Then why are you still here?" Mercer let out a short, humorless laugh. "Because I'm an idiot, probably." Eli narrowed his eyes. Mercer exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Listen, I'll make you a deal. I won't call social services. I won't force you to go anywhere you don't want to. But I can't walk away knowing you'll sleep out here again." Eli's grip on Nia's wrist tightened. He didn't like this. Deals with adults never ended well. Mercer must have sensed the resistance, so he added, "One meal. Somewhere warm. No strings." The word warm sent a shiver through Eli's bones. He wasn't sure if Mercer was lying, but at that moment, it didn't matter. His sister was freezing. They had barely eaten. If this was a trick, they'd run. They were good at that. Eli looked at Nia. She nodded, just once. "Fine," Eli muttered. "But we picked the place." Mercer raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Deal." They picked a 24-hour diner a few blocks away, the kind where the lights buzzed, and the smell of grease and old coffee lingered in the air. The waitress barely looked at them as they slid into a booth near the window, her tired expression one of someone who had long stopped asking questions. Nia sat against the wall, her journal still clutched in her hands. Eli sat beside her, arms crossed, eyes darting between Mercer and the exit. Mercer didn't try to fill the silence. He simply ordered 3 plates of pancakes and coffee, leaning back in his seat as if he had all the time in the world. When the food arrived, Nia hesitated for only a second before digging in. Eli ate more cautiously, watching Mercer between bites. "You're not eating," Mercer noted, taking a sip of his coffee. Eli scowled. "Why do you care?" Mercer studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because I used to be you." Eli's grip on his fork tightened. "Liar." Mercer didn't flinch. "No, but I get why you think that." He set his coffee down. "I grew up in foster homes. Some were okay. Some weren't. But I learned quick. No one comes for kids like us." Eli's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. "People walk past," Mercer continued. "They look right through you. They tell themselves it's not their problem. And if you're lucky, you learn how to survive before the city swallows you whole." Nia swallowed a bite of pancake, eyes locked on Mercer. "Did anyone help you?" Mercer was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "Once." Eli scoffed. "And what?" "They saved you. Gave you a happy ending." Mercer's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Not exactly." Eli frowned. Mercer leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "But they gave me a chance, and sometimes that's enough." Eli hated the way those words made something tighten in his chest. He pushed his plate away. "We should go." Mercer didn't stop them. But as they stood, he pulled something from his pocket and slid it across the table, a small folded piece of paper. "My number," he said, "if you ever need it." Eli didn't touch it, but Nia did. She slipped it into the pocket of her hoodie without looking at Mercer, her fingers lingering on the paper just a second too long. Eli grabbed her wrist. "Come on." They walked out into the cold night, the warmth of the diner already fading from their skin. Eli didn't look back. Nia did. Mercer was still sitting there, watching them go, his expression unreadable. For the first time, in a long time, Eli felt something shift. Not trust, not hope, but something. And he wasn't sure if he liked it. Secrets in the journal. The air outside the diner was sharper than before, as if the city had exhaled its last bit of warmth, leaving behind only cold and silence. The moment Eli and Nia stepped back onto the streets, the reality of their lives settled over them like an old frayed blanket, worn, heavy, suffocating. The brief warmth of the diner, the full stomachs, the man with haunted eyes who had tried, really tried, to reach them. It was already fading into a distant memory. They walked quickly, sticking to the edges of the streets, avoiding pools of light cast by flickering street lamps. Instinct guided them back to their hiding place beneath the old bridge in Jackson Park, their feet moving on autopilot. Eli didn't speak, but Nia knew his mind was racing. She felt the small piece of paper in her pocket, Mercer's phone number pressed between her fingers. It felt heavy, like it carried something she wasn't ready to admit. A lifeline she wasn't sure they could afford to take. She wouldn't tell Eli she had kept it. Not yet. When they reached the bridge, they slipped into the shadows like ghosts, retreating to the thin blankets and battered backpack that held everything they owned. Eli sank to the ground, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Nia pulled out their mother's journal, flipping through its pages by the dim glow of a stolen flashlight. Eli glanced at her. "You're looking again." Nia didn't answer. She turned another page, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The journal had been their mother's lifeline, her secret place to write things she hadn't been able to say aloud. Some of it was just memories, things she had wanted them to remember. But there were other pages, darker ones. On those pages, their mother had written about someone dangerous, someone who had been after her, someone who might still be after them. Eli shifted, stretching his legs out. "We shouldn't keep reading it." Nia's head snapped up. "We have to." Eli met her eyes, frustration flickering across his face. "And then what?" "We find out something bad." "What does that change?" "Mom's gone, Nia." Nia's throat tightened. "We have to know why." Eli exhaled sharply and rubbed his face. He hated this, hated that she couldn't let it go, hated that deep down, he knew she was right. "Just read it out loud," he muttered. Nia swallowed and turned the page. The ink was smudged in places, as if their mother's hand had been unsteady. "He found me again today. I thought I lost him. I thought we were safe, but he's watching. I feel it in my bones. I don't know how much longer I can run." Nia's hands trembled as she turned to the next entry. "I have to protect them. They can't know. They're just children. But if anything happens to me, I pray they find someone to trust, someone who can keep them safe." Eli's heart pounded. Their mother had known she was in danger. She had been running. From who? His jaw clenched. There's gotta be a name. Somewhere. Nia kept flipping, desperate. The pages were frantic now. Her mother's handwriting hurried, the loops of her letters no longer smooth. And then, "If I disappear, it's because of him." Nia's breath hitched. "He's not just some man. He's someone they all listen to. Someone the police won't question. Someone with power." Eli leaned closer. "Keep going." Nia turned another page. And there it was. A name. A name that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Eli's fists clenched as he read it. No, that can't be right." Nia's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's him." They both stared at the name. A name they had seen before. A name that had been on the news. A name that carried weight in this city. A name that belonged to someone untouchable. Eli's breathing turned shallow. Nia whispered, "What do we do?" Eli didn't know. But one thing was certain. If their mother had been running from him, then they were still in danger, and there was no one they could trust. Not even Mercer. The officer's guilt. Daniel Mercer sat in his car, parked in a dimly lit alley a few blocks away from Jackson Park. The hum of the city never truly faded, even at this hour. Neon signs buzzed, horns blared in the distance, and the occasional shuffle of feet on pavement reminded him that the city never really slept. But right now, none of that mattered. The two kids, Eli and Nia, their faces wouldn't leave his mind. Mercer had seen a lot in his years as a cop, too much, if he was being honest. He had learned how to compartmentalize, how to push things down so deep that they never clawed their way back up. But tonight, something was different. He couldn't shake the way Eli had looked at him, sharp, guarded, like a wolf backed into a corner. He had seen that look before, on himself. Mercer sighed and ran a hand down his face, his fingers brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw. He hadn't meant to get involved. A part of him wished he had just kept walking, pretended he never saw them. But it was too late now. He reached for the worn leather notebook that sat on his passenger seat, the one he used to jot down names, places, things that didn't sit right with him. He flipped it open and scrawled two names, Eli and Nia. He underlined them twice. Then, beneath that, he wrote one more, Rebecca Kane. Their mother. He had looked them up after leaving the diner. His gut had told him there was more to their story, and he had been right. Rebecca Kane, deceased. A case closed before it had ever really been opened. Official cause of death, accidental overdose. Mercer clenched his jaw. He remembered the case now. It had been late one night, just another call in a long shift. Nothing about it had seemed off at the time. A woman found in her apartment, unresponsive, no forced entry, no immediate signs of struggle. A bottle of pills spilled on the floor, open and shut. Another addict, they had said, just another tragic statistic. Mercer had believed it. And now he wasn't so sure, because Rebecca Kane had been running from someone. And if what those kids had found in that journal was real, if she had been killed, then the truth had been buried. Buried deep. Mercer exhaled sharply and flipped to a clean page in his notebook. He needed to dig, and he needed to do it quietly. Because if someone had the power to make her death disappear, then they could do the same to him. Jackson Park, beneath the bridge. Eli sat with his back against the cold concrete, staring at the water. The surface rippled under the moonlight, dark and endless. Nia sat beside him, her knees pulled up to her chest. Neither of them had spoken in a while. The journal rested between them, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze. "What are we supposed to do?" Nia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli exhaled through his nose. "I don't know." Nia hesitated, then reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out something small. Eli's stomach twisted when he saw what it was. "Mercer's number. You kept it?" he asked, his voice sharp. Nia didn't look at him. "I don't think he's like the others." Eli scoffed. "He's a cop, Nia. So that means we can't trust him." Nia was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, she said, "I think Mom wanted us to find someone we could." Eli flinched. Mom. The word hurt more than it should have. He wanted to believe Mercer was different. He really did. But believing in people, that got you hurt. "I'm not calling him," Eli muttered. "I didn't say you had to." Eli frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Nia met his gaze, her fingers tightening around the piece of paper. "It means maybe I will." Eli's chest tightened. "Nia." But she didn't let him finish. She stood up, tucking the number back into her pocket. "We have to do something," she said. Eli wanted to argue, but the truth sat heavy on his tongue. She was right. They couldn't keep running forever. And if what was in that journal was real, then someone wanted them gone. Eli looked down at the journal one more time. the last entry their mother had written. If I disappear, it's because of him. And now, they had his name, a name powerful enough to make people look the other way, a name that could still destroy them. Eli exhaled and looked at his sister. Just be careful, okay? Nia nodded. But Eli knew that whatever was coming next, there was no such thing as careful. The truth uncovered. The city felt different tonight. The same neon glow flickered on cracked pavement. The same scent of gasoline, damp earth, and cheap fried food lingered in the air. But for Eli, the streets no longer felt like home. Home. The word felt foreign now. Their mother was gone. Their safe places were running out. And now they had a name that could get them killed. Nia had barely spoken since they left the bridge. She walked beside him, her fingers clenched around the journal like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Eli glanced at her. He hated seeing her like this. We should go somewhere else, he said, breaking the silence. Nia didn't look at him. Where? Eli didn't have an answer. She stopped walking, standing under the glow of a broken street lamp. The flickering light made her look smaller somehow. I think we need to call him, she said finally. Eli's stomach twisted. He didn't need to ask who she meant. No. Eli. No, Nia. We don't know him. He could be working with him. Nia shook her head. You don't believe that. Eli rubbed his hands down his face, frustration clawing at him. What choice did they have? They had no proof, no allies, just a journal full of secrets that no one would believe, except maybe Mercer. Eli exhaled sharply. Fine. Nia blinked. Fine. He scowled. But we do it my way. She nodded quickly, pulling the small slip of paper from her pocket. Her hand shook as she dialed the number on a stolen flip phone, her breath hitching as it rang. Once. Twice. Then. Mercer. His voice was gruff, tired. Nia hesitated, her fingers tightening on the phone. Eli snatched it from her hand. It's us. Silence. Then, where are you? Doesn't matter, Eli snapped. We found something. Something big. Mercer's voice hardened. Talk to me. Eli looked at Nia. Then, gripping the phone tighter, he spoke. We know who killed our mom. Mercer's apartment, 1:47 a.m. Daniel Mercer stared at the cracked screen of his phone, his heart pounding. He had spent the last 2 hours digging through old reports, following a feeling he couldn't shake. And now, Eli's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. We know who killed our mom. Mercer exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had read the autopsy report again. Everything looked clean. Too clean. Rebecca Kane's death had been labeled an overdose, but the inconsistencies gnawed at him. The toxicology report had flagged something strange. Traces of a substance that shouldn't have been there. A sedative, one that wasn't in the pills found at the scene. Someone had helped her overdose. Someone had made sure it looked like an accident. And now her kids had a name. Mercer didn't ask them over the phone. Too risky. If someone had the power to cover up a murder, they had the power to listen in. He needed to meet them. Fast. An abandoned warehouse, 2:35 a.m. Eli chose the meeting spot. A rundown warehouse near the docks, long abandoned. No cameras, no people, just rusted steel beams and shattered windows that whistled with the wind. He stood in the shadows, watching the empty street. Do you think he'll come? Nia whispered. Eli clenched his jaw. Yeah. Minutes later, headlights cut through the darkness. A familiar car pulled up, and Mercer stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow of the city behind him. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't move fast. He just walked. Eli held his ground. Mercer stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets. His eyes swept over them. All right, he said. Tell me everything. Nia opened the journal, flipping to the last pages. Our mom wrote about him. The man who was after her. She turned the book toward Mercer. His eyes landed on the name. And his expression changed. The color drained from his face, his shoulders stiffened, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. Eli saw it. "You know him," Eli said, his voice sharper now. Mercer didn't deny it. Instead, he looked away, exhaling shakily. Nia's voice was small. "Who is he?" Mercer swallowed hard. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he said the name aloud. And suddenly, everything made sense. Because the man who had killed their mother, the man who had been hunting them, the man with power, was one of his own, a high-ranking officer in the department, a man with connections, a man who could erase records, forge autopsies, make problems disappear, a man who had been watching Mercer too. Silence filled the warehouse. Mercer looked at the kids, really looked at them. They weren't just runaways. They were targets. And now so was he. Mercer exhaled, his decision already made. "I need you to trust me," he said. Eli's jaw tightened. "Why?" Mercer didn't hesitate. "Because if we don't do this right, if we don't take him down together." He met Eli's eyes, his expression unshakable. "We're all dead." The cost of justice. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "If we don't do this right, we're all dead." Eli's fingers curled into fists. Nia's grip tightened around the journal, her knuckles pale against the worn leather. Across from them, Mercer stood rigid, his expression carved from stone. A high-ranking officer, one of his own. The man responsible for their mother's death was someone who wore the same badge Mercer did. Someone powerful enough to erase evidence, someone with enough reach to make people disappear. The kind of man no one could touch. Eli's gut twisted. "So what do we do?" Mercer exhaled slowly. "We don't take this to the department." Eli scoffed. "No kidding. If we go the normal route, this disappears. He disappears us." Mercer's voice was grim, his fingers flexing at his sides. "We have to be smart." Eli narrowed his eyes. "Why do you care so much?" Mercer hesitated. "Because I should have seen it before." There was something in his tone, something that made Eli pause. Mercer wasn't just helping out of guilt. This was personal. Nia stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "You knew him, didn't you?" Mercer's jaw tightened. Eli watched his face carefully. "He was your partner." A muscle twitched in Mercer's cheek. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Mercer spoke. "He was more than that," he admitted. "He was my mentor." Eli sucked in a sharp breath. "He taught me everything when I was a rookie, showed me how to move through the system, how to close cases, how to survive in a department full of corruption. And I trusted him." Mercer let out a bitter laugh. "But I didn't see him for what he really was." Nia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Until our mom." Mercer nodded. "I didn't question her case. I should have. But I was too blind, too loyal. And now?" His gaze darkened. "Now, I'm going to fix it." Eli studied him for a long moment. This wasn't just about them anymore. Mercer was a man trying to atone, and he had just made himself a target. Eli exhaled sharply. "So what's the plan?" "The setup." They had to be careful. They had to be patient. The man they were going after, Detective Jonathan Sloan, wasn't just powerful. He was calculated, dangerous. If he even suspected they were coming for him, he would disappear, leaving nothing but bodies behind. Mercer laid it out step by step. "We need proof," he said, "something undeniable. A confession, a document, a connection that ties him to Rebecca's death." Eli crossed his arms. "And where do we find that?" Mercer's expression was grim. "In his office." Nia's eyes widened. "At the precinct?" Mercer nodded. "Sloan's careful, but every corrupt cop keeps something. Insurance in case they ever need leverage. If we can get into his office and find it, we have a shot." Eli felt his pulse quicken. break into a cop's office, in a police station. This was insane. But then again, everything about their lives was insane. And they were out of options. The infiltration. The plan was simple. Mercer would get them inside. Eli and Nia would slip into Sloane's office while Mercer distracted anyone watching. They had one chance, one night. No mistakes. The precinct at night was a different world. Quieter, but still humming with tension. Mercer led them through the back entrance, his badge getting them past the night staff. He walked with purpose, like he belonged, like nothing was out of the ordinary. Eli and Nia stayed close, their hoods up, their steps light. Office is down the hall. Mercer murmured under his breath. Doors locked, but I can override it from the inside. Eli nodded. His heart pounded. Mercer peeled off toward the front desk, striking up a conversation with the night officer on duty. Eli and Nia slipped into the shadows. They reached Sloane's office in seconds. The door loomed before them, solid and unyielding. Nia pulled out a thin piece of metal she had swiped earlier. I can pick it. Eli kept watch as she worked, his body coiled with tension. The seconds stretched. Then, a faint click. Nia pushed the door open. They were in. The truth in black and white. The office smelled of leather and cigarettes. A mahogany desk sat in the center, pristine, orderly. Eli wasted no time. He yanked open drawers, rifling through files, searching for anything that could take Sloane down. Nia moved to the filing cabinet, her fingers trembling as she flipped through folders. Then, Eli, she whispered. He turned. She held a file in her hands, her face pale. Eli snatched it, flipping it open, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A contract, signed by Jonathan Sloane, addressed to an unknown private fixer. The request: eliminate Rebecca Kane. Make it clean. Eli's vision blurred with rage. This was it. The proof. The smoking gun. They had him. But then, a voice behind them. Cold. Amused. You kids really should have stayed in the shadows. The final confrontation. Eli spun just as Detective Sloane stepped into the office, his gun drawn, his smirk deadly. You're persistent, I'll give you that, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Eli's pulse thundered. Sloane tilted his head. Mercer's a fool if he thinks he can outmaneuver me. The office door swung open again. Mercer barreled in, gun raised. Sloane. His voice was ice. Sloane sighed. Danny, you should have left this alone. Mercer didn't lower his weapon. You killed their mother. Sloane smirked. I did what was necessary. Eli's hands trembled with fury. She was our mom. Sloane's smirk widened. And now, you're just two street rats in over your heads. Nia took a step forward. No. Her voice was calm. Steady. You made a mistake. Sloane chuckled. And what's that? Nia lifted her phone. The screen recording. His confession. Sloane's smile vanished. Mercer moved first, faster than Eli thought possible, disarming Sloane in one swift motion. The next moments were chaos. The station erupted with noise as backup arrived. Mercer handed over the evidence. Sloane screamed about framed jobs and setups, but the recording was damning. The walls of his power came crashing down. And by morning, Jonathan Sloane was in handcuffs. A new dawn. Eli and Nia stood outside the station, watching the sunrise. For the first time in months, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter. Mercer stood beside them. It's over. Eli exhaled. What now? Mercer hesitated. That's up to you. Nia looked at her brother. Maybe we stop running. Eli met her gaze. Maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth staying for. And for the first time in a long time, Eli believed it. A future worth fighting for. The first morning without fear felt strange. For so long, Eli and Nia had lived on the run, their bodies wired to expect danger lurking in every shadow. But today, the world felt different, lighter. Sloan was behind bars. The man who had hunted them, who had stolen their mother from them, who had tried to erase them, he was gone. And yet Eli couldn't shake the unease curling in his gut. Because just because one monster was gone, didn't mean they were safe. Nia sat beside him on the steps outside the precinct, the worn journal clutched in her hands. "We did it," she said, almost like she didn't believe it. Eli exhaled. "Yeah." Mercer stood a few feet away, speaking with another officer, one of the few he actually trusted. The station had been chaotic all night. The confession, the evidence, the sheer shock of a high-ranking detective being arrested had sent waves through the department. Some officers had looked genuinely horrified. Others had kept their heads down, like they had known something was off, but had chosen silence over action. And a few had looked angry. Not at Sloan, at them. Eli caught Mercer's eye, and the man nodded slightly, finishing his conversation before walking over to them. "It's done," Mercer said. "They're processing him now. The DA is already building a case." Eli didn't relax. That fast. Mercer sighed. Sloan was powerful, but the moment he slipped up, he became a liability. People are more than happy to throw him under the bus to save themselves. Eli scoffed. "Figures." Nia looked up. "So, what happens to us now?" Mercer hesitated. Eli already knew what was coming. The system. CPS. Group homes. Being shuffled around like paperwork until they aged out or disappeared into the cracks. "No," Eli said immediately. Mercer sighed. "Eli." "No," Eli snapped. "We're not getting dumped into the system. We'll run before that happens." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You don't have to run anymore." Eli's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not going to some place where people just pretend to care, where they throw us into a house with strangers and forget about us a week later. That's not a life." Mercer studied him. "You've had a rough life, kid. I get that." Eli scowled. "You don't get anything." Mercer's gaze sharpened. "I get more than you think." Eli opened his mouth to argue, but Mercer's next words stopped him cold. "I was you." Silence. Eli frowned. "What?" Mercer crossed his arms. "I grew up in the system. Group homes. Foster care. I ran more times than I can count. I fought. I got angry. I shut people out." Nia's grip on the journal tightened. Mercer continued, his voice steady. "And then someone gave me a chance. One good person. One person who didn't just throw me in another house or pretend I didn't exist." He exhaled. "And because of that, I made it out." Eli looked away, the lump in his throat making it hard to breathe. Nia was the one who asked the question hanging between them. "What are you saying?" Mercer rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm saying, you have a choice. You don't have to go into the system." He hesitated. "You could stay with me." The words hit Eli like a freight train. He blinked. "What?" Mercer shrugged, but there was something nervous about it. "I don't know how to be a parent. Hell, I barely keep my own life together most days, but I know what it's like to be where you are. And I know I don't want to see you disappear." Nia's eyes widened. "You'd really do that?" Mercer exhaled. "Yeah, if you want." Eli's mind raced. A cop, taking them in. After everything. He should have said no. He wanted to say no. But then he looked at Nia. For the first time in months, maybe even years, there was hope in her eyes. Eli's throat tightened. Mercer sighed. "Look, I know this isn't easy. I won't force you into anything. You want to run. I won't stop you." He met Eli's gaze. "But if you stay, I promise you this, you'll never be alone again." Eli swallowed hard. The system had failed them. The world had failed them. But maybe, just maybe, this was different. Maybe Mercer was different. Nia looked at Eli. waiting for him to decide. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run. Eli let out a slow breath. Okay. Mercer blinked, as if he hadn't expected Eli to actually say yes. Then, slowly, a small, almost relieved smile tugged at his lips. Okay. 1 month later. Eli still wasn't used to it. The quiet. No sirens screaming in the background. No hunger gnawing at his stomach. No shivering under thin blankets on freezing pavement. Mercer's apartment wasn't fancy. It was small, a little messy, and the couch had definitely seen better days. But it was safe. It was theirs. Eli sat on the balcony, watching the city hum below. Nia sat beside him, her sketchbook open on her lap. She had started drawing again. It had been years since she had. Mercer walked onto the balcony, leaning against the railing with a steaming mug of coffee. "Not bad, huh?" he said. Eli exhaled. "It's weird." Mercer smirked. "You'll get used to it." Eli wasn't sure he would. But maybe that was okay. Mercer set his coffee down and ruffled Eli's hair. "Come on, we're getting pancakes." Eli scowled, swatting his hand away. "I hate that." Mercer just chuckled. "Too bad. Get your shoes on." Eli rolled his eyes but stood, following Mercer and Nia back inside. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a kid. He felt like he had a home. And maybe, just maybe, he finally had a future.